migration. Today we're together on a topic that is as important as migration. It's of course the electricity sector reform and energy transition, and what it means for our country, what are we doing, what kind of policy we're having. So let me have brief remarks, and then we have a nice panel of our colleagues that will dwell into the details. But let me come to you, let's explain to you how we come to you here at the Policy Center and more broadly in Morocco on those issues. There's of course a context that we share together, Mexico and Morocco, and more generally also here in both on our continent, is really that this is taking place. The needs of the reform of the electricity sector and more broadly the energy transition is taking place in a specific context, both at the geopolitical level. This is now seen with the glasses of security, autonomy, strategic autonomy of countries, but also, of course, with the perception of the general public that the climate has not been really taken seriously by policymakers, and that we are living in a world that's under pressure. That has, of course, consequences on the way we build policies and, of course, the decisions of government. So the context is an important one. 5-6 years ago, the context was quite different, where both our countries laid down their strategy, their medium-term strategy. So this has to be integrated in the policies. The second one is, of course, policies and potential. And I'm glad that we share our experience. We have a lot to learn from Mexico, and Morocco has also very interesting experience in sort of moving the whole sector toward better outcomes for the population. It's not easy. One has to acknowledge that the energy transition and having an efficient electricity sector that serves our population, but includes as well the more disadvantaged portions of our population. The regulatory framework that's in place is a fundamental dimension, and it has to do with competition policies, it has to do with incentives, it has to do with the kind of PPP that we are able to put together, and the risks that goes with it. Of course, the fact that often the public sector gets the losses on its own balance sheet, that complexity of contract, it takes expertise, and that this is also what we're trying to get from this joint webinar with you at Comexi, is also your experience and how it worked, what didn't work, etc. There's of course the third point is innovation, science, and technology. This is a fast-moving sector where there are innovation. The science is essential, the relations, the interactions with the academic world, and of course what happens at the global level on new emerging technologies in the area of course solar, wind, but now hydrogen. It's in a way policymakers all around the world are sort of looking at those technology, and they make the choices more complicated, more complex. Information is not fully clear, what technology we dominate, etc. So it's really not easy. And when it's not easy, what you do, you share experience, you discuss, you have collective approach, you seek for advisory, and this is where, and this will be my concluding word, this is our role as think tanks. We are here to create the space for these discussions to happen, this process of experience sharing, of successes and mistakes, that is so essential in the way public policies are built, in countries, and or you experiment those policy, those public policies and their whole. And for us, it's particularly important to do it with Mexico. As you know, the Policy Center and Morocco, more generally, of course, has been working a lot on the wider Atlantic. It's enlarging, the concept of the traditional transatlantic relation to its south, in a concept that we we call the wider Atlantic, and of course Mexico is one of the most important countries in this. It's a larger acceptation, understanding of the Atlantic, and this is. That's why we've taken together. There are important topics where we can cooperate in this wider Atlantic. The last one was migration. Now is the electricity sector reform and the energy transition. So I'm really glad that we can provide this bridge of communications between our two countries and for the benefits of the larger community of the Atlantic. So let me close here and thank you again, Ambassador Wolf and your team at COMEXI. We're very happy that we continue this dialogue together for the benefit of our countries and also for all stakeholders interested in these reforms. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. It is a pleasure for us to work with the PCNS. For COMEXI, we're always glad to do this kind of work together. And please allow me to express my condolences and support for the earthquake suffered 10 days ago and my solidarity with the families and the victims of the earthquake in Morocco. And as a context, before starting, Mexico and Morocco have historically witnessed significant intervention from their respective federal and central governments in their domestic markets, especially within the electricity sector. So I think we have a lot of common experience that it will be very worth to share together and with the experts that will talk in this webinar. Regionally, Mexico energy reform faced scrutiny under the USMCA, hinting at potential impacts on North-South integration, while Morocco's renewal initiative faced legal challenges, particularly in integrating with the EU grid. I think these dynamics raise questions on regional collaboration, integration challenges, and future continental prospects. So I will be leaving the floor for those experts who can really talk about these issues. And thank you very much again for the Policy Center for the New South for working together with COMEXI and all the experts that we will have now in the webinar. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to thank you, both COMEXI and the Policy Center for the New South for organizing this webinar. It's an honor to be here with you today. To begin the webinar, each of our panelists will have a 10-minute period to present their views on this matter. I will read their bios as each of one is presented, and I will begin with Montserrat Ramiro. Montserrat is an Eisenhower Fellow and a Wilson Center Global Fellow. She is also a board member for energy companies. She was appointed commissioner by the Mexican Senate on September 18, 2014 for a 5-year period. In 2017, she became chair of the OECD's Network of Economic Regulators. She stepped down on January 2019 from both responsibility. She holds a degree in economics from the Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México, and she has also a master's degree in economics from the University College of London, where she specialized in environmental economics and natural resources. Additionally, she has a graduate diploma in finance and corporate social responsibility from Harvard University. She has nearly 3 years of experience in the energy industry, and we are very happy to hear her views today. Montse? Your 10 minutes begin now.
Okay, I'll start by sharing my, hold on, how do I share the screen? I had shared it before. Anyways, well, let me just, how do I share? Oh, here, got it. Give me 1 second, I'll try to be brief. No, I'm not doing it right. In more, maybe? Yeah, got it. Here it is. Okay, I'll try to be brief. I will not talk about energy reform as energy reform properly, mostly because what's happened in the last 5 or 6 years has been a series of changes, but I don't believe they can be trusted to be truly reforms. So I would just refer to those as policy changes, mostly because I believe what really happened, or what really can constitute reform, happened almost 10 years ago, when the Constitution, the Mexican Constitution, was amended to allow basically two main issues in terms of the energy sector, and those were transparency across the board in terms of information, and competition in every aspect of the energy sector value chain. So for me, real reform happened 10 years ago, and there has been a decision to sort of revise and reassess that reform in the last 5 or 6 years through a series of policy changes that have also attempted reform but have not been fruitful at that. And in my perspective, that was a good point, from basically the judiciary powers that prevented that from happening. Anyways, so I want to start with this very, very probably absurd quote from Alice in Wonderland, saying, where do you want, if you don't know where you want to go, what the road, where the road takes you doesn't really matter. So and that mostly is important for our conversation. If Morocco is going to, in any way, shape, or form, think of what's happened in Mexico as a series of experiences that are worth thinking about and analyzing and sharing, it's very important to know why this lack of perspective in the context of climate change and energy transition, and what the consumers and citizens across the world need, these last policy changes do not have a specific point or a specific goal. And that's why I chose this image of Alice in Wonderland. There is a clear road ahead in energy in the world, and that is, I'm not going to break it to you because it's obvious, but that is renewables, competitiveness, protecting the consumers across the globe, and using energy as a means to solve most of our current era problems. However, our president and the current administration has, in my opinion, chosen the wrong one. In the last 5 or 6 years, we have faced, or we have suffered the consequences of a policy that is centered in state-owned companies as dominant players. Instead of focusing on competition for consumers, it has chosen state-owned companies for the sake of control, mostly political control over any other economic metric. So that's kind of the context of where we are. However, in the coming years, everywhere, and that is why I'm sharing it for Morocco, the following 3 areas are super important, and those are energy policies that impact on investment and that have a clear drive for climate change and environmental policies. These areas, all these 3 areas, have been impacted negatively in the last 5 or 6 years in our country, mostly because in order to have these 3 pillars work for the national economy wherever you are, and socially for the citizens of any country, these 3 pillars have to work in an environment of competition, or at least in an environment that is clearly transparent in terms of decision making, regulatory certainty, and of course as well legal certainty. And these 3 pillars have been impacted very negatively with all of the policy changes of the last 5 years. Let me move ahead. Julia, can you tell me when I'm lagging and I have little time, please?
Yes, you have 5 minutes, Monse.
Oh my God. Well, okay. Well, anyways, so I'll go through these very quickly. The independent. I was talking about transparency and consumers, and the only way we have transparency for consumers and consumers enjoy better outcomes in terms of energy, both in terms of clean energy and cheap energy. It all involves certainty and information. And one of the main pillars for information and certainty is, of course, regulation. And within regulation, the independent system operator of any system, electrical system, that is, regardless of if it's embedded, as it was before in Mexico, embedded in the national company, or if it's an independent system operator for companies that are both private and public, the independence of the operator is basic. And that is not only because it reassures the public that the prices are what should be, and that the energy is dispatched efficiently, but also because it creates from the ground up a sector that allows for fair competition and equal opportunity for all participants. And that, in the end, transcends to the consumers in terms of better prices and cleaner energy, which I believe are the most important. I'm just going to go through these because it doesn't really matter. Efficient cost-based dispatch is basic for energy transition. Now we no longer have in the world a decision to make between renewables in terms of cost and thermal energy from fossil fuels in terms of cost. Now renewables are cost efficient, and storage has proven to be more cost efficient by the year, and it will probably end up in the next 5 years being absolutely cost efficient. And we no longer have this dilemma between fossils and renewables. And this goes back to the main issue of any electrical system in the world, which is, can we be a clean system that allows for cheap energy for its consumers and to be an input to the competitiveness of the whole economy in terms of cheap energy to produce other services and goods.
1 minute, Monse.
Okay, and if that is the case, what's needed is a strong regulatory body with certainty, a strong independent system operator, and fair rules for everyone. And what we've done in Mexico, and I think it's something that Morocco could benefit from, is we have legally a very cohesive system, but we had one mistake was made, and that was in the regulator. One of the main things that could be strengthened, and that I would hope anyone trying to reform their energy system could think of, is the regulator needs to be absolutely independent and absolutely technically capable. And that is assured by its budget and by the way the staff and the members of the board are appointed. Those need to be absolutely apolitical, and they need to prove a technical background that is, to say it bluntly, that needs to be bulletproof. And though there were a few issues with a regulatory body, and the regulatory body in Mexico wasn't financially, it was technically independent, but it wasn't financially independent. And that's where kind of how do you say this? Not the vicious cycle, but the opposite of vicious cycle. Well, the good policies that were installed cracked. And I believe that if there is one thing that could be learned from this, is regulation is crucial, and it provides the state and consumers and society the way to be able to profit from electricity as an input to the whole competitiveness of a country. So I would
Monse,
strengthen the independence.
Sorry to interrupt, but your time it's over.
Okay, well, we could send the presentation if it's of any interest, and I'm here to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Monse. Our next presentator is Rin Beraha, Senior Economist at the Policy Center for the New South, which she joined in 2014. She's currently working on themes related to energy issues and their impacts on economic growth and long-term development. Her research areas also cover trade and regional integration challenges in Africa. Previously, she has also worked on questions related to gender inequalities in the labor market of North African countries. Rim spent 3 months on the International Monetary Fund in 2016 in the commodities unit of the research department. She holds a state engineering degree from the National Institute of Statistics and Applied Economics, INSEA. Please, the floor is yours. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. So let me first share my screen. Can you see it now? Perfect. So thank you very much. So for my presentation, I will focus on Morocco and I will discuss its energy strategy, giving a brief overview of its power sector reform, as well as its choices for the energy transition. So quick facts about Morocco before I begin. So first, Morocco is experiencing a growing energy demand that is driven by economic growth and economic development. Second fact is that its energy mix is currently dominated by oil, mainly used for transport, and coal, which is mainly used for electricity generation. Although renewable energy, the share of renewable energy has increased throughout the years, and I'll go back to that later on. And the third fact is that Morocco is also dependent on energy imports, which in time of commodity price shocks, particularly in the case of high prices, results in a high energy bill. So I'll start now by giving you a glance at Morocco's energy reforms. So Morocco undertook a deep transformation of its energy sector. One main date to keep in mind is 2009, when Morocco adopted its energy strategy, which is considered as a breakthrough from previous strategies in the sense that it sets ambitious targets for renewable energy. And the strategy focused on 5 main objectives that you can see here on the chart. And the main ones are ensuring energy supply independence, widespread access to energy, as well as protecting the environment through clean energy. And within this framework, Morocco also aimed to increase the share of renewable energies in the installed power capacity to 52% by 2030. Now, to oversee the deployment of renewable energy, Morocco has worked to create the legal and regulatory framework that is necessary for that. And this slide shows the different actors in the sector as well as how they complement each other. And I'll highlight only 1 or 2 due to time constraints. So we have, for instance, the Ministry of Energy Transition and Sustainable Development, which is responsible for Morocco's energy policy. But we also have Moroccan Agency for Sustainable Energy, MAZEN, which is responsible for the development of all renewable energy projects in Morocco. We have beside that, of course, our National Agency for Electricity and Water, which is state-owned and called ONE, the national utility. Now, if there is an area that can illustrate Morocco's deep transformation of its energy sector, it's the power sector. And the policy and institutional framework for of the power sector in Morocco is comprised of national energy strategy, as well as several public and private operators, and a series of laws linking the core element of these strategies with the implementing agencies that I've shown before. So I have here displayed the simplification of the power sector institutional framework. So the power sector is structured as a single buyer market with element of third-party access to the transmission and distribution grid. And if you want to sum up the characteristic of the Moroccan power sector, it's that the national public utility, ONE, has only been partially unbundled despite the various reforms and continues now to be involved in both generation, transmission, and distribution. So I would like to go back in time here and delve more into the power sector reforms in Morocco. So the latter can be divided into 4 distinct phases, and due to time constraints, I will go very fast on these. So we have the first phase, which happened after the independence, and the most notable event in this period was a series of serious power supply shortages during the 90s, coupled with some financial hardships of the power utility, which provided the impetus for the initial steps towards sector reforms with the introduction of independent power producers. Now, the second phase is that of partial liberalization of generation, where a series of reforms were adopted to allow for market entry in electricity generation and distribution, as well as to expand the regional integration of the power systems and initiate a vast rural electrification program. So during this period, we've seen some steps toward regional integration with the development of the first electrical interconnection between Morocco and Spain. And in 1996, Morocco launched the rural electrification program, which my colleague Afaf will talk about more in a few minutes. Now, the third phase is that of privatization, where there were some efforts to privatize distributions, and at the same time, an ambitious draft legislation to unbundle the sector and introduce competition in generation was prepared by the government in the early 2000s. However, this fell short of comprehensive sector reforms. And during this period, we've seen a second electrical interconnection between Morocco and Spain, further progressing in terms of regional integration. And the fourth period, which from 2008 till now, and during this period, several important developments were made, including further liberalization for the generation segment and the national energy strategy that I presented earlier, as well as the establishment of implementing agencies. And if I have to highlight one main event in this period is the Renewable Energy Law 1309, which was announced in 2010. And this law made it possible for private power producers to use the transmission grid and enter into direct purchase agreements with end users in order to sell electricity produced from renewable resources, which marked a further step into opening the sector to competition. During this period—
5 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So during this period, the Moroccan government also decided to withdraw subsidies for most petroleum products, except for those used by only for electricity generation as well as butane. And we've seen also the creation of the National Energy Regulatory Agency aimed to regulate the energy sector. Now I would like to move and focus here on Morocco's energy transition choices. And as I said before, Morocco does not have significant oil and gas resources, but it has significant renewable and energy resources, which are now proven to be economically viable. So as you can see here, Morocco has an exceptional potential for wind and solar energy, which are distributed almost all over the entire territory, providing for complementary availability of both resources, which is an asset to mitigate the intermittency effect on the grid. Another encouraging factor is that renewable energy has entered the virtuous circle of falling costs due to technological developments, as was mentioned by the previous speakers. And their costs are now falling into the gray area that you see here in the graph, which represents the cost of fossil fuels. So the combination of a significant and diversified renewable energy potential, coupled with technological development, as well as affordability of renewable electricity, has enabled Morocco to engage more in its energy transition. And you can see here some of the achievements. So since this strategy, the share of renewable energy, excluding hydro, in electricity generation has increased from almost 0% in 2000 to nearly 15% in 2020. And if we look at the installed capacity for renewables, it stands now at 37%, translating significant improvement despite an uncertain global environment. At the same time, Morocco has also in addition to renewable, Morocco has also relied on gas in its energy transition roadmap. So I've mentioned here some of the steps of the roadmap for natural gas that was unveiled in 2021. And during the same year, Morocco has also launched a new process to create an integrated economic and industrial sector centered around green molecules, so namely hydrogen, ammonia, and methanol. And in this roadmap, Morocco has assessed the potential domestic demand as well as the international market it can capture. And according to this roadmap, most of Morocco's production would be aimed at exports, and it would account for 75% of the demand for green hydrogen by 2050. Now, for the 2 minutes that I have left, I would like to highlight some of the achievements, and challenges before giving you back the floor. So Morocco's energy strategy has brought numerous benefits, namely ensuring a secure supply of energy, better stability of electricity availability, as well as the launch of the first major projects in renewable energies. But there are still several challenges that need to be overcome in order to further the energy transition and go beyond the electricity sector. So in 2020, Morocco has actually conducted a diagnostic of its economy in order to identify the growth lever that it can leverage on to contribute to a more sustainable and resilient growth. And among the conclusions found was the urgency of overcoming some of the challenges, namely through the establishment of an institutional framework that is centered around a strong and independent regulator, which has been started but needs to be accelerated. Another question is that of the separation of roles of the players, namely producers, transporters, and distributors, and as well the responsible liberalization of the sector, in particular through the effective opening of green energy production to competition, as well as the whole restructuring of the sector's public company or utility. Now, in terms of the green hydrogen, and I want to emphasize this point because we've been hearing a lot about green hydrogen lately, and I would like to really temper this enthusiasm with some facts. So there are still several challenges that need to be overcome. The main one is the cost of production of green hydrogen, which is currently 2 to 3 times higher than that of gray hydrogen due to the high cost of electrolyzers. But also the production of green hydrogen requires a significant amount of green electricity, which raises the challenge of increasing green electricity in Morocco, as well as the need for water resources, which poses a threat to Morocco because it suffers from frequent droughts. And there's also the challenge of transporting green hydrogen. So a lot need to be done in this area, which is why we need a lot of R&D, innovations, join the pilot projects, etc. And I'll conclude on one point that I haven't spoken about much, which is that of regional integration, mainly because it has been very limited so far and constrained between Morocco and Europe. But this underscores the importance of establishing a strong foundation from which further integration can occur, which calls for numerous reforms related to markets. For instance, adopted market-based energy prices, developing shared infrastructures, or harmonizing, for instance, regulations and policies. So I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to answer more questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sarkik is a senior economist, an engineer specialized in energy transition and environmental studies. She holds a master's degree in energy strategies from the School of Mines in Paris and a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering with a major in environmental science from Al-Akawayan University in Ifrane. Afafa Sarkik was an analyst in oil and gas mergers and acquisitions consulting firms in Paris, a venture capitalist analyst in clean tech venture fund in Paris, and an asset management analyst with top consulting firms. She joined the Policy Center for the New South in 2020, where she currently leads reflections on energy markets, energy transition, and sustainable development policies. Ms. Sarkik, you have 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So I will start by sharing my presentation. Let me just, okay. So today I will introduce you to a very interesting case study on Morocco's experience in guaranteeing universal access to energy. So some of you might ask, is this even a topic that we need to, is this even relevant today, access to energy? Well, there are more than 700 million people today that still lack access to electricity, which makes it nearly 1 in 9 people in the world, and most of them are in Africa. And we tend to think here at the think tank of Morocco as an integral part of Africa, and we want to contribute to its economic and social improvements. So Morocco's case is interesting because the kingdom was at the forefront of energy access planning, and it leveraged unique policies, regulation, and electrification modes to reach full electrification on a national scale. And in this presentation, we will see how fast the country achieved universal access to energy, what approach it has followed to reach these goals, and lastly, its intercontinental cooperation to guarantee rural electrification in sub-Saharan Africa today. So just to give you some numbers here, the latest numbers show that there are close to 733 million people globally without access to electricity, of which 80% are in Africa. So Africa actually remains the least energized region in the world. So today, we can say that more than half of Africa's countries still have an electricity access percentage of less than 60%. And in fact, some of the most populous countries in Africa have an electrification rate of less than 60%. We can cite the Republic of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Tanzania, etc., which have less than 60% access to energy to this day. And there are also 6 African countries with electrification rates that are less than 20% to this day, including South Sudan, Chad, Burundi, Malawi, the Central African Republic, and Burkina Faso, which makes this issue very, very important to study. So indeed, the forecasts done by the International Energy Agency expect that more or less most regions in the world will reach universal access to electricity, except by 2030, except for sub-Saharan Africa. Why is energy access so important? Because it is an enabler of all other sustainable development goals set by the UN. And as we all know, they are all very deeply connected, and the lack of progress in one hinders progress in the others. But today it is difficult to imagine, for example, zero poverty or sustainable cities or equality, gender equality, or even access to good health and good quality education without access to electricity. Let's cut to the chase. So we are here to answer one question: how do we guarantee, how do we reach the 2030 agenda goal on electricity? Today we are going to see the case of Morocco. So in the 1990s, actually the electrification rates, and especially rural electrification rates in Morocco, was very low. Even compared to its North African neighbors. For example, Tunisia, Algeria, and Egypt had already reached 70%, 80%, 84% electrification rates, rural electrification rates, while in Morocco, we had hardly reached 14%. And this is 30 years ago. So after a couple of pilot-scale electrification programs, the Moroccan government actually launched the Global Rural Electrification Program in 1996 with the objective of reaching universal energy access in less than 15 years, which was really ambitious. So actually, not to spoil, but the PERG was a success, and it was actually reached 6 years prior to the set deadline. So by 2015, we had actually reached nearly 100% electrification rate in Morocco. To this extent, the country actually experienced the fastest increase in electrification, and especially rural electrification on the African continent. And with this program, an additional 2 million people had now access to, households had now access to electricity, and this whole program cost $2.5 billion, and we will talk about the financial aspects later on. So the main question is, how did this country achieve these results? So actually the PERG, this is the acronym that I'm going to be using from now on, actually received full support from the government at the time, because there was this big political will to reinvest in rural areas, not only in energy, but also in water, infrastructure, schooling, etc. So the government made 2 important decisions which proved absolutely pressing compared to other African countries' approach. So the country actually departed from the traditional rural electrification agency approach, which meant that the energy access programs were financed by a dedicated agency, while the utility, the national utility, would only manage infrastructure and charge customers. This was widely used in sub-Saharan Africa, and it has proved to be widely unprofitable and unsustainable. In the case of Morocco, it was the ONE, as we said, the national utility, which was responsible for everything from A to Z, from planning, implementation, financing, project financing. And more importantly, the utility was responsible for the electrification of the whole country on and off the grid, which was something that was completely unthinkable at the time, given that utilities are not usually they're not usually used to mini grids or even worse, solar home systems. So this was actually quite the innovation in Africa. And Morocco's other innovation was to adopt, as I said, an integrated approach to energy access. And it was the first time that a country would actually leverage all possible electrification modes around a national electrification plant. And it relied on solar and mini grids, which are now credible alternatives to grid extensions. And it's actually proceeded to door-to-door analysis of demand because in order to understand local energy demands, because as we know at the time, we didn't have any satellites or anything like that. And actually, it's matched the supply and the demand on a national scale. And as I said, remember at the time, there had been no geospatial planning tools, so they had to do everything by hand. And the third innovation that we might add is the economic sustainability of this project, and we will discuss that later.
You have 3 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. So all of this is nice, but how did we actually implement these ideas in practice? The first idea was to allocate roles the first idea was very important, and it was to understand what the utility could and what it could not do. So before the launch of this national program, the ONU performed an analysis and identified exactly how many households needed to integrate needed the electrification, and the costs for on and off grid electrification. And it's quickly understood that it could never reach universal access on its own because it needed solar home systems and mini grids to achieve that. So it's actually resorted to private expertise for off-grid solutions. The second aspect was it was very structured, and the major problem for ONU was how do we decide who can have access to the grid and who cannot, and therefore have to rely on solar home system. And once we know that, should we electrify everyone all at once, or should we do that in stages? So the national ONU actually drew a plan to electrify households. That's the cheapest, to put the priority on grid extension for the cheapest households, and it had actually allocated 20,000 euros dollars per household to access the grid. And once it surpassed that amount, we would resort to off-grid solutions. And also the third innovation was that the PERG was a textbook case study for financial sustainability because it leveraged all possible sources of funding, both locally and internationally, while preserving local sovereignty of the national utility. And most financial resources were actually local. It's actually resorted to a solidarity tax, and the consumer paid the 2.25% of on-grid sales to actually fund these projects. The country also resorted to concessional loans and equities. Municipalities also contributed through the value-added tax. And finally, for off-grid solutions, consumers actually had to pay 25% of the total investments, while ONO financed the remaining 75%. And we should note that concessional loans debts were only used for feasibility studies and setting up electrification plans in order to allow the state to safeguard the financial viability of the projects without actually endangering public finances of the future. I think I will stop here because
Yes, thank you very much. So now we will begin with some questions we have prepared for you today. I will ask the question and you, the three of you, may answer. We have also requested the audience for questions if they have any. So why don't we begin? What are the lessons learned from these experiences in your countries? Who wishes to comment?
If you want to, I can start because I wasn't, I was very rushed and didn't focus a lot. Anyways, I think the lessons learned need to be, and it's very different for a country like Morocco than for a country like Mexico, because it all depends on the rate of electrification, and the challenges are different depending on what the challenges in terms of who has access and how that access is assured. So I believe the main lesson should be the basic concept of power for what? What is the objective for electricity in a country? And it should be, in my opinion, it should be making possible the development of the country, both in terms of economics and also in terms of quality of life for people. And that goes back to the basic challenge of our current situation worldwide, which is climate change. And if that's so, then how are we about to ensure that everyone has access to electricity? What kind of electricity and at what price? And I believe technology has showed us the way in terms of it should be renewables with a mix of thermal and storage. The basic cost of solar plus storage is, depending on some geographies, it's almost as what the cost of CC, which is gas-fired combustion combined cycle plant. So it's no longer an either or. It should be an and. Most countries need to have a wide array of technologies to ensure that that generation is both clean and cheap. But then you go back to how do you assure that from happening? And that can happen when you have, for example, the challenge is transmission, which is a very common challenge, not only in countries that are not fully electrified, but in terms of the challenge of integrating renewables to any grid. Transmission is key. And transmission is something that it's easier to handle when it's centrally planned. And that means the state can control and ensure that it has the opportunity to grow for the sake of the whole country. And so you go back to who regulates and how do you regulate that? My take is electricity markets are easier when you have the activities that are prone to competition, open to competition, and those that are more natural monopolies, such as transmission, managed by the state, which is different to managed by the government. And you go back to what the role of the regulator is. And the role of the regulator should be to look out not for the policies, but how those policies are are beneficial to consumers. And I would leave it at that, but I think the institutional framework to ensure that regulation is independent of the government in turn, and that transmission is full, it goes to its full potential, and generation is left to those that know how to do it best, which is probably the private enterprises, is a very virtuous cycle.
Thank you, Montse. Ms. Verhav, Ms. Arkik.
Sure. If I may, I would like to emphasize on the last point that Montse spoke about, which is that of regulations. And I think that for Morocco, one of the most important lessons is the importance of good regulation and institutional framework in allowing the country to overcome the challenges and achieve its goals. So I think that for Morocco, the fact that it has a clear strategy, particularly for electrification in rural areas, and this was highlighted by Afaf's presentation, which were the reasons for the success of the PERC. So now we have new challenges that are brought about by the energy transition and Morocco's ambitions to lead the energy transition, which highlights now the new challenges that need to be overcome in terms of having cost-effective prices for electricity, the question of liberalization of the electricity market, as well as the question of competition with the private sector. And here again, regulation is of utmost importance, and this is why it is important to have a national regulator that is also independent. And for the case of Morocco, it was created in 2016. However, its implementation took a long time, which also was delayed with the COVID pandemic and crisis that followed through, and it was operational, I believe, in 2021. So there are still a lot of efforts to be made in terms of reforming our utility, having clear regulations about who produces and who accesses the grid and who can sell renewable energy in the grid. And this is, I think, one of the most important things, regulations and institutional framework.
Thank you. Ms. Sarkik, do you have anything to add?
Yes, as per myself, I would like to emphasize what Montse had said, which is that integrated and centralized planning is key. We need to leverage all possible technologies, as we saw in Morocco. Even at the time in 1996, solar and mini grids were credible alternatives to grid extensions, and they were affordable also. We need also to, this integrated planning is actually very complex and requires complex regulatory mechanisms, as was said before, and the regulators need to balance rights with obligations. With PPPs, if we give you access to an exclusive area and if we give you subsidies, you need to meet your electrification targets. And finally, I would also like to emphasize on projects financing, which needs to be sustainable. It needs to have a mix of national funds, international donations, especially for developing countries, concessional loans from MDPs, and finally, also consumer contribution. It doesn't need to be only subsidized by the states.
Thank you very much. We will address the second question, which is, what are the next steps? Why don't we begin with Ms. Sarkik in this time around?
For myself, as I spoke about universal access to electricity, which is part of Sustainable Development Goals set by the UN, I believe the next step is cooperation between those who've had successful experiences like Morocco's national utility, and it's actually doing that by cooperating on rural electrification plans with other sub-Saharan countries such as Senegal, Gambia, Niger, Mali, etc. And this is only in 2022. And we need to actually cooperate with regional and also continental organizations. And we are also doing that in Morocco with the Arab Electricity Union, the Mediterranean Energy Observatory, and the Association of African Electricity Companies. So basically cooperation, sharing experiences, and yeah, that's about it.
Thank you very, very much. Montse, why don't we cut in between Morocco so to hear your take on the next steps, and we can close with Ms. Berahab.
Yeah, well, in the case of Mexico, I believe the next steps are almost obvious. And we need to go back to what the law says, and we need to go back to allowing renewable integration and allowing also, but at the same time, for the state-owned company CFE to be profitable and not put all of the fiscal pressure on it by forcing it to generate more than it can. And so, if I may, my suggestion for what I would see the next steps for Morocco could be focusing on transmission and electrification, and gaining a little bit of traction in generation, allowing for private sector participants to generate in the country, and providing regulatory stability for that to happen. And so the state could focus on the biggest challenge of all, which is transmission and distribution. That would be my take. Thank you.
Ms. Berahab, what would be your next steps?
Yes, of course. I would like to highlight one of the points that was mentioned by Afaq, which is cooperation. And if I might add one element to that is also Morocco's increased integration with European partners. So during the last COP, during the COP27, Morocco and several European countries, so namely France, Germany, Portugal, and Spain, have sealed the sustainable electricity trade roadmap, which aims to facilitate the mutually beneficial exchange of renewable electricity between Morocco and these 4 EU countries. And I think the next step is to make this deal a reality and implement it. Now, going back to domestically, I think, and as Monsi said, even for Morocco, it is very important to ensure that the regulator is fully capable of doing its objectives, so to enable it to do so. Another element is to complete Morocco's liberalization reforms, which have been started but not completed. I think it is a very important area, as well as to restructure its national utility in order to enable it to perform its strategic functions of modernizing the electricity transmission network and also supporting the whole sector's reforms.
Thank you very much. So we have 12 minutes late. I'm gonna give more, sorry. We have 12 more minutes. So I'm gonna give you 4 minutes each to close. Montse, can you begin?
Thank you. Well, I would just say that we should not forget that probably 10 years ago, the challenge for electricity and for those who were in charge of electricity policy was probably twofold. One was to provide it and be sure that supply was stable and in good quality. The other was, it was threefold actually. It was to provide it in terms of quality, and the other was in terms of price, and the other was in terms of making an election between a choice between price and the source of that generation. And nowadays, technology has changed, but the challenges for clean energy have been raised. We need to be as globally, we need to be able to truly go and bet on renewables in order to achieve our aspirations of climate change to be real and to be substantial. And so I believe now the term in terms of price, the challenge is less so because technology has given us all of these capabilities. But now the challenge is in terms of what are the social benefits of transmission? Who pays for transmission? How do we balance transmission with storage? How do we balance distributed resources from system resources? And what does the state and regulation as a state responsibility? How does the state make sure that these things are virtuous for the people? And we should not forget that electricity has a very important and I would say essential social role in our countries, in every country. And that social role is enhanced by its responsibility in terms of climatic situations. And so we need to make countries need to make a decision on whether or not we want to plan for the next 3 years or we want to plan for the next 15 years. Even if technology changes so fast, we need to focus on those things that will allow us to be able to use that technology in the future. And I think that is the main challenge of power systems everywhere. And it is the balance between storage and transmission and what it entails for people and how that is essential for even the social stability of those countries. And sometimes we tend to think of social issues very differently or apart from all of those power industry, electricity industry, technological challenges. And I think they should be always taken together. So I would say that those are the main issues in the future, and all of those issues can be addressed if you have a good and well thought institutional framework that works for everyone.
Thank you, Montserrat. Ms. Arkik? You're on mute.
Thank you. So if I would like to close with something is that for Morocco, we have actually been quite serious about our structuring projects. And we have made achievements actually with the PERC program for rural electrification. We have made great achievements in reaching 37% or to 38% of installed capacity of renewables in the span of a few years actually. This has been very structuring projects for the country, and it's also built quite a strong reputation worldwide of how serious we are about our energy transition and our implication in sustainability. But these projects actually are quite high capital intensive, and the financial instruments developed to this kind of choices do not actually meet nowadays the needs of the private sector to drive this green transition from the bottom up. And when I talk about this, I'm talking about clean tech startups, which is actually one of my past experiences as I worked in the innovation field. And actually, what we know about clean tech startups is that they require very patient financing, and the public financial instruments aimed at these types of startups here in Morocco are actually quite lacking. We have great, in a great innovation ecosystems. We have fab labs, we have incubators, we have the financing, etc. But it's not tailored to the clean tech sector. So for me, maybe in addition to those big structuring projects, big national plans, like such as the National Electrification Plan, the Green Energy Transition Plan, and the roadmap for green hydrogen, maybe focus more on grassroots, on small companies, on clean tech startups with the right, regulatory framework, financing, and innovation ecosystem to drive this transition.
Thanks a lot, Ms. Sarkik. Ms. Berha?
Yes, a lot has been said so far, so I will be very brief. And perhaps take a look at beyond the electricity sector. So as Afaf was saying, Morocco has made significant improvement in terms of electrification. It also made good progress in terms of renewable energy development, even though more can be done. But if you truly want to speak about an energy transition, we have to go beyond the electricity sector and look at the sectors that are hard to decarbonize. Now, I'm referring here mainly to the industrial sector. And we've been hearing a lot about the role of green hydrogen as this new solution, but we have to be very careful as to not only jump into the bandwagon, because this hydrogen is a technology like wind and solar, like any other technology, but it's still a nascent industry. So a lot needs to be done in order to understand it and try to identify how it can be employed in order to advance our energy transition. Hence the need for further research and the development of new pilot projects that study this technology and try to decrease the costs that are still very high now, which ties in with the point that Afaf mentioned about incubators and startups. And all of this calls for a very comprehensive strategy with clear sequencing. And this is where the regulator again comes into play in order to regulate this whole sector and set clear objectives and clear plans so that there is no overstepping or contradictory objectives along the way.
Thank you very much. This has been certainly a very interesting discussion. It highlights the importance of planning and knowing what the goals are as countries are. So I thank you very much. I thank COMEXI and the Policy Center for the New South for organizing this webinar. And with this, we conclude. Thank you all of those who have joined. It's been a pleasure being with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you.